If you're dealing with SIBO and you're trying to figure out which probiotic is actually going to help your gut, you've probably noticed something. Spore-based probiotics are everywhere right now, and they're marketed as the stronger and better option for your gut. But let me ask you something. Have you ever taken a probiotic that was supposed to help your gut only to end up feeling worse? Well, that happens more often than people realize. And many of the probiotics folks are turning to right now, the spore-based probiotics, they behave very differently than what most people expect. So for someone with SIBO, that difference can sometimes make your symptoms worse. Now, to understand why spore-based probiotics can backfire in SIBO, you first have to understand how these bacteria actually function inside of the gut. And once you see that clearly, your next step becomes obvious. Right now, there's a lot of attention being given to spore-forming probiotics. Whether these are called spore-forming, spore-based, soil-based, these are for the most part bacillus species that we're talking about. And these are unique in that they form protective spores, as the name implies, that help them survive harsh conditions in the GI tract. And because of that resilience that is inherently built into these organisms, they're often marketed as the most resilient probiotics available. And biologically speaking, they are a pretty hardy organism. But strength and resiliency is not always exactly what someone dealing with SIBO needs. Remember, SIBO is not simply a problem of bacteria. It's a problem of bacteria living in the wrong place, in the wrong concentrations, and also being the wrong forms of bacteria for being in the location that they are. So before you make a decision about whether spore probiotics make sense for you, we first need to understand how do these organisms behave once they enter the body. To help you get as much as you can from this conversation, let me give a few quick recaps of some of the SIBO facts that are going to be relative in this spore-based probiotic conversation. Remember, SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and under normal conditions, the small intestine really contains very few bacteria. Most of the bacteria in your GI tract are in the mouth and in the large intestine. And that's where they belong. That's where they do most of their work at. But when certain systems break down, your digestive system, for example, begins to slow, meaning your motility slows. When your digestive signaling and secretions, your acid, your enzymes, your bile, when those secretions and signaling for those secretions become disrupted, what ends up happening is that the bacteria begin to accumulate in the small intestine. And once bacteria start to build up in that environment, they begin to ferment. That's the natural action of bacteria. And so they're fermenting. And they're doing it in a location where they shouldn't. And of course, that then leads to symptoms like bloating, gas, distension, the abdominal pressure, discomfort very quickly after eating often comes on. And so if you keep this in mind, now let's take a look at the defining biological features of these spore-based organisms, these bacillus probiotics, and more importantly, why these features are really not always ideal and don't work well with individuals that are struggling with SIBO. The first thing to know is that the spore-based organisms can survive stomach acid. Well, remember, that's one of your initial defense lines. You want optimal secretion of hydrochloric acid for not just digestive purposes, but also to be able to kill off a large percentage of bacteria moving through your stomach and into the small intestine. Well, spore-forming bacteria produce protective structures that are known as endospores. And these spores are incredibly resilient. This is really the hallmark of these organisms because they allow the organism to be able to survive the entire harsh environment of the stomach and upper small intestine. The stomach acid, the digestive enzymes, the bile. These are harsh secretions, but those endospores, that spore-forming nature, allows them to be resilient and to not succumb to the effects of those digestive secretions. And this is why these probiotics reliably reach the intestines alive, right? So they They just have a resilient capacity that other organisms aren't going to have. Now, if you put that in the context of SIBO, the small intestine is already a site of bacterial overgrowth. So delivering additional bacteria to that environment may not be very helpful early on. Once these spore-forming organisms evade the effects of the stomach acid, they're going to reach the small intestine. And they don't remain dormant in the small intestine. They germinate. And that means that they become metabolically active bacteria. They begin to interact with nutrients, start to use those nutrients for themselves at the expense of you. They're going to have effects on other microbes. And in an otherwise healthy gut where you don't have a large overgrowth, this may not be a problem. You're likely going to see some beneficial effects from these spore-forming organisms moving through. But that's not our conversation today. Our conversation today is in SIBO. And this is where fermentation is already happening in the small intestine. And when you introduce additional active bacteria, there's a high probability you're going to increase gas production. You're going to see fermentation and that additional pressure and discomfort that comes along with that fermentation because of the gas production. You'll get the bloating and distension. And one of the things that I've seen that I'll share with you that I think is a good clinical reality to acknowledge is that these elevations in these bacillus species, remember bacillus is the group of bacteria that we're talking about here, it's not uncommon to see elevations on stool reports for bacillus species. So therefore, and that's generally accompanying some type of overgrowth. So what it's pointing out is that you wouldn't want to add additional bacillus species when there's already too many of these species there in the first place. If we continue to follow these spore-forming organisms through the small intestine, they've made it through the acid, now they're germinating, and when we think about the environment in the gut, you also have to think in terms of the immune system because they're integrated together. And these spore-forming organisms, these bacillus species, they can interact directly with the immune system as well. And this interaction comes through what's known as the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. Many times that's just abbreviated GALT, G-A-L-T. But the point here is that the immune signaling can sometimes support microbial balance, more likely when you've got a healthy gut. But when you've got a SIBO environment, that's when you're going to start to see that because of this interaction with the gut immune system, you'll likely get an increase in some of the inflammatory cascades, so the intestinal inflammation will increase. You'll find that from that, you're going to see an activation of the immune system, so the immune system becomes more hypervigilant about reacting to things, and there's just this overall general heightened sensitivity. So you may notice reactions from foods you eat or from different things that you're exposed to that in other scenarios, maybe you're not reacting to those. And the point here is that what we're looking to ultimately try to do is make sure that we don't add more complexity to an already dysfunctional immune system state locally in the GI tract. And if that's ultimately happening, then that's going to exacerbate symptoms related to SIBO, not what we're interested in. If bacillus species are interacting with the immune system locally in the gut, we also have to acknowledge that they're interacting with the mucosal surface, with the mucus layers. And once these bacillus spores germinate, they're not just transiently moving through the GI tract. They're not just passing through without any interaction. Many strains interact directly with that mucosal environment of the lumen, and that's that protective layer between the opening, if you will, of the gut environment into the actual lining of the gut. There, between those two, you've got the mucus layer, and it lines the gut and it protects the gut lining. And you'll even find that in that environment, you may have some biofilms integrated in there. But the point here is that the interaction, this interaction with these bacillus species and the mucus layer, this interaction is one of the reasons that these organisms are sometimes used as probiotics. So there's some attributes here, and in certain situations that contact with the mucosal surface may influence microbial balance. So again, not trying to just say these are all bad. I'm trying to keep this conversation in the context of SIBO for you to see why you would want to avoid these. This is when many folks that are dealing with SIBO, the small intestine is already dealing with irritation of the intestinal lining. You're seeing increased permeability. Immune activation is going to be coupled right in there with that. Microbial imbalance often is woven into this same picture. When these bacteria actively interact with the mucosal surface and are introduced to that environment, their response may not always be a calming response. They're generating and creating a signal, and when that signal gets passed along in the wrong context, that's when you may see an upregulation of the immune system. It just becomes more reactive. Again, the sensitivity becomes a problem. There's irritation in an already unstable environment. And so while mucosal interaction is often presented as a benefit of these organisms, it's very important to acknowledge that the context of SIBO changes that story a bit, because you're introducing these organisms into an environment that's already stressed, and the same properties that may contribute to symptom reduction in some situations in this context may actually aggravate the symptoms rather than supporting recovery. The last point I want to bring to your attention is really taking us out of the gut for a moment and just stepping back to the big picture, and to note that when you look at bacillus species, these evolve primarily as environmental microbes. So there's a reason we call these soil-based organisms. That tells us where ultimately most folks had their exposure from. They were either directly interacting with the soil, they were eating whole foods, and the bacillus species were on the whole foods and they were ingesting them, or they had some other type of environmental contact. Modern probiotic supplements deliver literally billions of spores daily. And, if someone's taking multiple dosages per day, that's going to multiply that amount. So that represents a very different exposure picture than what historically has been the case. Historically, the exposure pattern has been that someone would have small, inconsistent amounts of exposure, and when you compare that to now in the current environment, what we see is that the amounts that are being delivered aren't small amounts comparatively anymore. They're much larger amounts for a shorter duration. So you compare lower amounts over a longer duration versus now where you've got higher amounts in a shorter duration. The metabolic effects of that have the potential to be much different. What's the primary takeaway from this video? Well, it's quite simply that if you're someone who's struggling with SIBO and you're in the active stages of gaining control of your overgrowth, and then you're going to be moving towards restoring the digestive secretions and the motility and all the defense systems in the body that offset the onset of SIBO, the story for you and the takeaway here is bacillus species are not likely the direction you want to go at this time. Don't take away from this conversation that spore-based probiotics are inherently bad organisms. But when someone is dealing with SIBO, introducing additional bacteria to the small intestine is often the wrong move. And remember what SIBO actually is. It's not simply a gut imbalance, it's a bacterial activity occurring in the wrong location with the wrong types of organisms. And spore-forming bacillus species, they have the potential to make that worse. Now, in the next video, I'm going to show you when spore-based probiotics can actually make sense and why timing matters more than most individuals realize.